If someone told you a decade ago that the United States and Venezuela would once again be on the brink of a showdown, this time with aircraft carriers, foreign powers, and global markets in the mix, you'd probably think they were exaggerating. But here we are. And the truth is a bit uncomfortable. The 2025 crisis isn't just political. It's a mirror of the world we're stepping into. A world where old alliances don't matter, power shifts fast, and even a single miscalculation can shake economies overnight. Most people think this story is about Trump and Maduro shouting at each other, but that's the surface. Underneath, the real conflict involves oil, military influence, sanctions, shadow alliances, and a Latin America caught between giants. And here's the paradox. The more both sides claim they don't want a conflict, the faster the region moves toward one. It's counterintuitive, but it's exactly what makes this crisis so explosive. What looks like chaos is actually strategy. What looks like stability is actually a countdown. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what's happening, but why this confrontation matters for global power, energy markets, and the future of U.S. influence in the hemisphere. You'll see patterns the news won't show you, connections experts talk about behind closed doors, and scenarios that could reshape Latin America for an entire generation. So stick around until the end, because once you see the full picture, you'll never look at U.S.-Venezuela relations the same way again. The calm before the storm didn't feel like calm at all. Anyone who's followed U.S.-Venezuela tensions over the years knows these crises don't appear out of thin air. They simmer. When Trump returned to office, his Trump Foreign Policy 2025 approach immediately revived the old distrust between Washington and Caracas. Meanwhile, inside Venezuela, Maduro pushed the series of maneuvers that almost felt like a preemptive shield against what he sensed was coming. It reminded me of watching a chess player who moves defensively, long before the attack even begins. For context, by early 2025, Venezuela's economy had shrunk more than 80% since 2013, according to IMF data, and that desperation created fertile ground for political volatility. Maduro, facing internal fractures, tightened control over the military and intelligence agencies, classic steps before a major confrontation. Analysts who lived through similar crises always say, watch the small signals, not the big ones. And those signals were everywhere. Oil output falling, new agreements with Iran, troop reshufflings, and subtle propaganda spikes. All pieces that would later feed the Venezuela crisis explained narrative. When Trump stepped back into the White House, his advisors pushed for a harder stance than before, arguing that Maduro had become too comfortable during the Biden years. That's when the phrase Trump versus Maduro stopped being political rhetoric and started sounding like a geopolitical collision course. Venezuela responded by reopening military cooperation channels with Russia, and suddenly the early months of 2025 felt like watching storm clouds gather on a horizon you hoped would stay clear. And yet, no one realized this tension would eventually tie directly into sanctions, oil disputes, and the looming Venezuela 2025 conflict that was about to explode. When the U.S. reinstated and expanded U.S. sanctions Venezuela early in 2025, the energy sector was hit like a punch to the gut. The new measures targeted PDVSA, gold exports, and shipping partners involved in Venezuelan crude, instantly tightening the financial news. Analysts debated whether Trump was pushing for regime pressure or strategic leverage as part of broader Trump Foreign Policy 2025 goals. Either way, oil markets reacted fast. Venezuela's exports fell below 550,000 barrels per day, according to Bloomberg, creating ripple effects in global supply. And once again, the resource battle became the heartbeat of U.S.-Venezuela tensions. Those sanctions also reshaped how Maduro positioned the country. Forced to find lifelines, Venezuela deepened its partnerships with Russia, China, and Iran, effectively turning the crisis into a story of Latin America geopolitics colliding with global power struggles. China offered limited credit lines but avoided stepping too deeply into the conflict, while Iran seized the opportunity to expand fuel deliveries and military cooperation. It's the kind of strategic dependence that reminds me of businesses I've seen collapse after relying on just one or two major clients. Once those clients pull back, the entire operation becomes vulnerable. Venezuela was now dangerously exposed. For the U.S., the oil sanctions weren't just punitive, they were strategic. With global prices hovering between $80 and $90 per barrel, restricting Venezuelan crude helped reinforce American influence across energy markets, especially in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The White House publicly framed the move as Democratic-driven, but behind closed doors, it was far more about leverage. These ships weren't just economic, they were the fuel that powered the next stage of the confrontation. And as the sanctions tightened, the stage was quietly being set for the explosive events that would define the Maduro conflict 2025, and the escalation that no one could ignore. The Venezuela 2025 conflict didn't erupt from a single moment, but one incident lit the match. A disputed encounter near Venezuela's western airspace involving a U.S. surveillance aircraft. Washington claimed the jet was monitoring regional trafficking routes. Carricosa insisted it violated sovereign territory. Within hours, Trump took to social media, framing it as yet another provocation that justified stronger actions under his Trump Foreign Policy 2025 agenda. Maduro responded with fiery rhetoric, calling it an act of aggression orchestrated by the empire. And suddenly, what felt like routine friction turned into the sharpest spike in U.S.-Venezuela tensions in years. As the situation escalated, a series of clashes near the Colombia-Venezuela border added fuel to the fire. Venezuelan forces accused U.S.-trained Colombian units of assisting dissident groups attempting to enter Venezuelan territory. On the other side, U.S. officials pointed to satellite images showing Venezuelan armored vehicles crossing restricted zones. That's when real-time data streams, public satellite maps, defense tracking dashboards, and independent OSINT analysts started painting a picture that was hard to ignore. The term Venezuelan military escalation began dominating headlines, and for analysts, this felt eerily similar to the 2019 Gulf incidents where small encounters spiraled into global standoffs. Emergency responses were fast and intense. Washington elevated its Caribbean command alert level, while Venezuela placed air defense units on standby, a move that was reminiscent to the days when I lived through border crises in another region and learned that once military start mobilizing, de-escalation becomes a steep uphill climb. Inside Venezuela, national TV showed footage of anti-air missile batteries being repositioned near coastal zones. In the U.S., defense experts debated whether this was the beginning of a proxy confrontation or something far more direct. And just as both sides were adjusting to the heightened risk, a new wave of pressure started forming offshore, setting the stage for the military posturing that would shape the next phase of the crisis. Once the flashpoint unfolded, military movements became impossible to ignore. The U.S. reinforced its presence with destroyers, surveillance aircraft, and, most notably, the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's most advanced aircraft carrier. Officially, Washington claimed the move was meant to protect regional stability, but everyone understood the symbolism. This was pressure, power projection, and part of escalating U.S.-Venezuela tensions. It also aligned perfectly with Trump's harder stance under his Trump Foreign Policy 2025 agenda. Maduro responded with symbolism and spectacle. Venezuela launched large-scale military drills involving Sukhoi jets, anti-air artillery, and maritime units, much of it broadcast on state TV to maintain internal morale. Behind the scenes, intelligence reports indicated Russian advisors assisting with radar operations and Iranian technicians improving drone capabilities. Watching all this, I couldn't help remembering a lesson from a former military analyst I met years ago. When countries start practicing for war in public, it's because they're already preparing for it in private. The Venezuelan military escalation narrative fit perfectly. Public threats didn't help. Trump accused Maduro of harboring terrorists and warned of serious consequences if U.S. personnel were threatened. Maduro responded by saying Venezuela would defend its sovereignty at any cost, and his media outlets on both sides amplified propaganda, fear, and speculation. The crisis tightened even further. Social networks buzzed with satellite images, troop movements, and unverified rumors. That's when oil markets reacted again, with prices briefly jumping above $92 per barrel, a reminder that every military gesture also carried economic consequences. And just as the region seemed locked in a dangerous stalemate, the world's major power stepped into the arena, reshaping the conflict trajectory yet again. From the moment tensions peaked, major world powers jumped into the equation. Russia responded first, reaffirming its strategic partnership with Venezuela and sending additional military technicians to support Venezuela's radar and air defense systems.
Moscow's involvement wasn't surprising. After all, Venezuela owes Russia over $17 billion in loans and military contracts. For Putin, the escalating U.S.-Venezuela tensions were an opportunity to challenge American influence in the Western Hemisphere without directly confronting Washington. It echoed the Cold War-style proxy dynamics many experts feared would return under the Venezuela 2025 conflict scenario. China played a more calculated game. Beijing didn't want open conflict, but it also didn't want to lose access to Venezuela's oil fields, where Chinese state companies still hold major stakes. So China kept communication channels open with both sides, offering diplomatic mediation while quietly increasing economic coordination with Maduro. This balanced act reminded me of large investors who diversify during market turbulence, not out of fear, but to preserve leverage. China's influence in Latin America geopolitics has grown steadily over the last decade, and its actions showed how even a neutral stance could reshape the Maduro conflict 2025. Iran, meanwhile, leaned in hard. Fuel shipments increased, intelligence sharing deepened. Tehran saw Venezuela as a rare foothold in the Americas, and every round of U.S. sanctions Venezuela pushed the two countries closer. At the same time, Latin American nations began taking sides. Brazil called for de-escalation but remained critical of Maduro. Colombia tightened security on its border. Mexico tried to position itself as a mediator. These divisions didn't calm the situation, they fractured the region even more. And as rival alliances crystallized, what came next looked less like a diplomatic crisis and more like a long-term geopolitical storm waiting for its next phase. As the crisis entered its next stage, analysts started modeling possible scenarios. The most likely short-term path was further tightening of U.S. sanctions Venezuela, especially around oil shipping networks and financial intermediaries. Trump's advisors argued that sanctions were the safest way to keep pressure high without escalating into direct conflict. Classic Trump foreign policy 2025 logic. But sanctions alone rarely solve political crises. I often compare them to strict diets. They can work, but only when the surrounding conditions support real change. Venezuela's conditions are anything but stable, and each new sanction risks deepening the Venezuela 2025 conflict rather than resolving it. A second scenario involved proxy confrontation, especially along the Colombia-Venezuela border, where armed groups, smugglers, and political factions intersect. Some intelligence reports have even suggested Russian and Iranian operatives expanding their presence in Venezuela, raising concerns that the crisis could mirror Syria's early dynamics, small, indirect clashes that gradually widen. Investors watching global markets already see the pattern. When you have geopolitical friction tied to energy producers, commodities like oil, natural gas, and even gold tend to spike. Anyone studying this situation should look into resources like The Prize by Daniel Yergin to grasp how energy and geopolitics intertwine. It's essential knowledge for anticipating market shifts driven by Latin America geopolitics. Then comes the most unpredictable scenario: limited military engagement. Not a full war, but targeted actions, maritime standoffs, or cyber attacks, moves that fall below the threshold of open conflict yet reshape political outcomes. Whether Maduro survives politically depends on how long he can leverage nationalism without collapsing economically.
Whether Trump pushes harder depends on how this crisis influences his regional strategy and domestic image. And just as the world watches these possibilities unfold, the story isn't ending, it's evolving. The next phase of the Trump versus Maduro standoff won't be decided solely by diplomacy or power plays, but something far broader: how the international system absorbs or rejects this tension in the months ahead. When you look at everything happening between the U.S. and Venezuela right now, it becomes clear that this crisis isn't an isolated event. It's a blueprint for how global power struggles are evolving, fast, unpredictable, and influenced by players far beyond Washington and Caracas. And understanding these dynamics isn't just interesting, it's essential if you want to make sense of the world you're living in. Conflicts like this define oil prices, shape elections, move markets, and shift alliances that affect entire regions. But now that you've seen the deeper layers, the sanctions, the military pressure, the foreign alliances, the economic stakes, ask yourself, what do you think will happen next? Will the U.S. double down on sanctions? Will Maduro hold on through foreign support? Could a small border incident trigger something bigger? Or will both sides eventually be pushed toward negotiation? Your perspective matters, and discussions like this are how communities build real understanding around geopolitics. Before you go, share your thoughts in the comments. Which scenario do you believe is most likely? Do you think the U.S. should escalate or de-escalate? How do you see this affecting Latin America's future? And if you want to keep learning about global power shifts, conflict, and the stories the news rarely explains, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive.